Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. Welcome to the Southwest Seattle Historical Society's program in conjunction with the Seattle Public Library's Southwest Stories. Our idea with this program is to tell the stories of our beautiful and unique peninsula, such as the stories of the Sherman Rock at Camp Long, the Tengu Fishing Club, the special story of music in West Seattle. There have been a wide array of topics. Today's program addresses the growing interest in preserving buildings that have historic meaning and represent special aspects of our heritage. The Southwest Seattle Historical Society has played a central role here in supporting the interest in preserving some of our special buildings, such as the Admiral Theater, the Alki Homestead, soon to reopen as a restaurant, the Log House Museum, the Ham and Campbell buildings in Alaska Junction. And you may be aware of a new opportunity to save an early Alki beach house, Eva's Stone House on Harbor Avenue. So please stay tuned to how this opportunity develops, as you may be hearing about a community-centered effort to save and relocate this little building. It will take the power of community to accomplish this. We are aware that there is a big interest on the peninsula bubbling about preserving some of the special heritage of this area before it all disappears in the unprecedented wave of redevelopment that we are currently experiencing. Today's speaker, Rebecca Ossa, Historic Resource Specialist with Seattle City Light, and also leads their Historic Preservation Program. Prior to City Light, Rebecca worked for the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office for 13 years as their architectural historian, managing the Certified Local Government Program, multiple grant programs, and reviewing rehabilitation tax credit projects. She meets the National Park Service's Professional Qualification Standard for Architectural Historian and the National Certified Public Manager Consortium Standard for Certified Public Manager. She also holds a Master of Science degree in Historic Preservation from the University of Oregon and a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley. In her spare time, she enjoys walking her 2 rescue hounds, rowing on Lake Washington, and exploring the Pacific Northwest. So Rebecca is going to share with us her tips and tools for evaluating and preserving historic buildings. And I'm happy to welcome Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Kathy. I appreciate it, and thank you for the invitation. And I want to acknowledge the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and Seattle Public Library, West Branch, for the invitation and for hosting the event. So, as Kathy mentioned, this is what I call Historic Preservation 101. It's a crash course introduction to historic preservation, and also an opportunity to offer tools and tips for preserving our historic buildings. And so just a brief outline for the lecture, talk about what is historic preservation, what is a historic resource, and then what do you do when you want to save or reuse a historic building, and the value of a historic structures report, a very valuable roadmap, and then choosing an appropriate historic preservation treatment, those preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction standards that we hear, that we also know as the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic buildings, which is quite a mouthful, so we usually end up calling it the standards. And then some tips for applying for grants, and then I'd be happy to take some Q&A at the end of the lecture. So with that, we'll try and answer what is historic preservation. So I thought this was rather appropriate because when I first started in my career, I always, had difficulty explaining what is historic preservation. It involves a lot of different disciplines, and so I thought this was appropriate because people see it interpreted very differently. So as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, what developers think we do. We, block the demolition of historic buildings. And then what our parents think we do in the center, we restore these beautiful buildings. What our supporters think we can do, walk on water. Oh, if only. What my friends think I do, I'm always harping about saving historic windows, no vinyl.
Yeah, we're doing that.
Frankly, what I think I do, I'm like, I need a t-shirt that says, I say historic buildings, what's your superpower? And then in reality, this is what I do. I am inundated in paper, reports, reviewing architectural drawings, going out to job sites, taking a look at what's being done, doing research. I spend a lot of my time in front of a computer, but it's all for a worthy cause. So I want to acknowledge this image is courtesy of the Adirondack Architectural Heritage Society in New York, but I thought it was pretty funny. So what is historic preservation? So it's an opportunity for us to ask what is important in our past history? What parts of our past can we preserve for the future? It's an opportunity to learn new things about ourselves or relearn things that we have forgotten. It's an important way for us to transmit our understanding of the past to future generations. Now, note that our understanding of the past changes as time goes forward. We gain some different perspectives and different insights that it's good to kind of update how we interpret the past. We also, it's acknowledging events, people, places, and ideas that we're proud of, and also recognize moments in our history that can be painful or very uncomfortable. And as I like to say, history is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's all history. And so I love this quote from Historic Seattle because I think it just really encompasses what historic preservation is. It's everybody's business. With each demolished historic building, we lose a piece of the past and a reminder of who we are and how we got here. And it's important to know who we are. Or to borrow another phrase, history matters. So what is a historic resource? And so in the profession, we tend to refer to the National Park Service, the National Register of Historic Places guidelines. They are kind of our Bible, guiding document. So basically, they define a historic resource in a few categories. It's either a building, a structure, an object, a landscape, a district, or a site. Typically, it's 50 years or older, and it's evaluated under 4 primary criteria. And this is a very shortened version of what's available online if you go to the National Register website. But criteria A is basically, is the property, the resource important for its history? Criteria B is the property important for a person, significant person that was associated with it? Criteria C looks at the architecture, the workmanship, and the design. Is it significant for that? And then criteria D looks at, is the property, the site, important for its archaeology? What can it tell us about our prehistory? And a property can be significant at a local level, at a state or a national level. And as I'll show later on, Seattle City Light owns the Georgetown Steam Plant, and that's a National Historic Landmark, and so it's nationally significant, so it's a pretty big deal. So this is just a slide showing some of the historic resources that Seattle City Light manages up at the Skagit River Hydroelectric Project in Whatcom County. And so we have bunkhouses in the upper left that we now use as offices. They date to the 1920s and 1930s when we had tourists come up there and spend the night to tour the Skagit project as it was being developed. Then we have in the middle the Alamo Dam, which was quite the showcase. J.D. Ross deliberately planned it that way. And then we have elevated water tanks. Water's important because we have 2 company towns up there. And then lower right-hand corner, we have a lot of tugboats, workhorses up there. And so Boundary is one of them. And it's a contributing resource to the historic district up there. In the center, lower center, we have residences. So 1950s minimal traditional houses. We have about, 25 maybe of them up there, and that are still being used as homes for City Light employees. And then we have a historic landscape in Ladder Creek Falls in the company town of New Haven. So we have a lot of variety of resources, and what's not shown there is like we have a historic locomotive, we have a dining hall, we have a general store, and we have 1950s and 1960s homes up there too, and 1920s bungalows. So quite a variety of things. We have a maintenance yard. And so, historic resources can be a variety of things. So going back to the National Register, there are what we call criteria considerations, 7 of them, for properties that fall into special categories. So those are those properties that are less than 50 years of age. So first one that comes to mind is Hoover Dam. It got listed on the National Register when I think it was like 36 years of age, thereabouts. Cemeteries are another very oddball one. The birthplace of a historical figure, a reconstructed building, a commemorative property, a religious property significant for its architecture or history, and moved properties. And I bring up the moved properties because I know the Southwest Seattle Historical Society is dealing with the Stone House. And it's a bit tricky because dealing with a moved property, you're taking it from where it gained most of its historical significance, and moving it, you lose physical integrity. And so it's a building or structure removed from its original location, but which is primarily significant for architecture value, or which is a surviving structure most importantly associated with a historic event or person. So an argument can be made of a moved property still being eligible to the National Register. It's a tough battle, but it can be done. So bringing it down to the local level in the city of Seattle, there's a Seattle nomination and designation process, Seattle landmarking. There are 6 criteria that they deal with, and properties that are 25 years or older can be considered. And then in King County, there are 5 criteria that a property can be considered, and then properties 40 years or older. So it just depends on the jurisdiction. But a lot of these local jurisdictions or the county or even state look to the National Register as kind of their foundation, and then they tweak it to whatever the local community governmental jurisdiction is comfortable with. So that's what they've decided. So the 25-year-old rule threw me for a loop because City Light has a systems control center that was built in 1995, 96, and it just hit that 25-year point. And I was just a little fearful that I'd have to write about the architecture because I don't even know how to start that conversation, because usually we wait that 50-year in order to have some scholarly research done on architectural styles to understand what was going on in the country, what was influencing those styles, to just kind of get an objective perspective. And for me, 25 years is a really short period of time to understand those trends.
Can I ask you a question,
Sure.
Rebecca? The National Register doesn't have any teeth in it, like that you can't, once it's been marked, it still could be changed.
Right.
It's the local landmarking that has
Yeah.
the teeth in it.
Yeah, the National Register listing is honorary.
Yeah.
But you're right, the teeth are in the local jurisdictions, the local governments. So I know in Seattle, I mean, we just got 2 substations listed, and now they have ordinance control, or they have controls and incentives, and so those are the teeth right there.
Rebecca, if something fit the criteria for as a national thing, but would you go after that versus through the local jurisdiction?
It depends on the property owner, what they want to do. Sometimes they go after all 3. Sometimes just one. The National Register, there's a lot of, it's pretty stringent, and it just depends. Well, that's not to say that Seattle and King County, they're stringent too. It just depends what you want. Because if you get a property listed on the National Register, you can go after rehabilitation tax credits. But then you can also go after local tax incentives by getting landmarked.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just understanding what is your end goal for your resource. Rehabilitation tax credit projects can get pretty complex. And so for those, you definitely need to get it listed on the National Register. And you only have to meet 1 criteria. You don't have to meet all 3, 4, it's just 1.
You just choose one you think you could.
What the property best qualifies under.
Mm-hmm.
What's your best bet, your best shot. So, but yeah, in Seattle and King County, there are requirements. So you look at the history of the resource, and then you have to figure out, okay, you have to look at the physical integrity. You have to see if there's enough there to convey that history, that significance. And so we call this the 7 aspects of integrity. And one of them is the location. It's basically the place where the resource was built. And that's pretty important because you have to move things. It kind of loses that connection, and that's It's really important because that's where the place got its history. The second one is design. Basically elements that constitute the form, plan, space, structure, and style of the property. So the architecture. You have a 1920s bungalow, you have an 1880s Victorian. It tells something about what was going on at that point in time. The setting, number 3, is a physical environment of a historic property that illustrates the character of the place. And that's pretty important. You know, you have a home in a residential area. If you want to pick up and move it and plop it somewhere else where it becomes very urban, it loses that setting. Materials is another important element. It's the physical elements combined in a particular or configuration to form the property during a period in the past. So the use of concrete, like the Georgetown Steam Plant, the use of wood in 1920s bungalows, craftsman style homes, the use of modern siding, T111, texture 111, 1960s homes. And so that all tells us a little bit about the history and the era in which it was built. Number 5 is workmanship. So basically it's physical evidence of the crafts of a particular culture or people during a given period of history. I keep going back to bungalows because, I mean, it's just a lot of craftsmanship to do the roof eaves, to do the porch columns. It's all out of wood. It references a certain ethic. But you can also get there with brick buildings. It's just, how they were put together, I think, is important. Item 6, feeling. It's a quality that a historic property has in evoking the aesthetic or historic sense of the past period of time. And 7, association, direct link between a property and the event or person for which the property is significant. So 6 and 7 are more of the touchy-feely of the 7. And so you want to get 1 through 5, a lot of the 1 through 5, because 6 and 7, you may have a lot of that for your particular property, but those don't carry as much weight as the other ones. Mm-hmm. And it's more intuitive, it's open to interpretation much more than the other ones.
On the stone house, that number 5, the workmanship, the story was that the woman that owned the house and was building it went down and picked up rocks from the hillside and from the beach, and then hired men from Hooversville that came over and put them up. So it's sort of like a story of the particular time during the Depression and trying to use used materials to survive. So I don't know whether it would fall under that or not, but it sounds interesting.
Like it. It sounds like it because it doesn't have to be what I call high style or those really ornate buildings.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a vernacular structure. Mm-hmm. It's evidence of just kind of the working class or whoever built it. Yeah. During the Depression, during the time when it was pretty pricey to get building materials. So go to the beach, go find the rocks. Right. In Nevada, we have a couple of houses out in the desert, bottle houses. They use bottles to build a house.
Oh. Wow.
So, you want to save and reuse a historic building. If only this would work. Basically, say, no, can't touch it because the historical society is going to be after us. If only that's what it took. But in reality, you kind of have to get your ducks in a row. You have to be kind of really factual, logical, and have a game plan. And it can be very overwhelming, frankly, to try to save a historic building because you're like, where do I start? Mm-hmm. And where you start, I think, is a historic structures report. And I brought an example of the Georgetown Steam Plant. It's a really thick binder, so you're welcome to look at it at the end of the lecture. But basically what a historic structures report, and it was something that was created by the National Park Service. I think the first one must have been done in the early 1970s. It's a valuable roadmap. It's a planning document for making decisions regarding your property. It centralizes all your documentation on the building. It provides a guide for budgeting, gives you a ballpark figure how much this work is going to cost you. It's all an estimate, but at least it gives you an idea, okay, this is what I have to start considering now and going after grants, which we'll get to shortly. It's also a place to talk about work scheduling and sequencing. You want to do certain things before other things, so you don't have to rip the previous work out to redo other things. And then basis of design for recommended work, basically explaining why you're doing what you're doing. So the Historic Structures Report gives a summary of existing conditions. It should be a readily accessible document so that the property owner, the manager, the architect, the user, preservationist can access it. It shouldn't be a static. It shouldn't be a document stuck on the shelf. It should be a very user-friendly document. It typically has a bibliography of archival documentation, so it documents where you've looked, what you found, so that, who knows, maybe later on in the future other stuff might come up and you can say, hey, it's not in here, let's add it. I put mine in a 3-ring binder because I'm always adding stuff or updating stuff. So it's a useful, definitely useful tool to have. And it's useful for interpretation based on physical and historical evidence. So you know what you're telling the public is based on research and fact, and it's not loosey-goosey history. It's a resource for further research and investigation, and then it's also a record of completed work. So collecting information for a historic structures report, a study typically includes basically hiring an architect, a preservation professional to do a preliminary walk through the property. They review and research archival documentations. Sometimes oral histories are very helpful too, the past users or people who actually lived and worked in the building. An existing condition survey, that's basically going inside and outside of the building and documenting what you see. Documenting the roof condition, documenting the wall conditions, the windows, the mechanical systems, the plumbing, the electrical. You really want to get a good idea of what your building is like currently. You also want to do measured drawings. So basically getting out there with the tape measure and measuring all the sides, the heights. If you already have architectural drawings, that's great. We were pretty fortunate with the Georgetown Steam Plant. We had a whole set, and so the architect could take those, bring them into CAD, and then use those to start a rehabilitation plan set to document or show what we wanted to do repairs on the building. Record photography, basically going out there and documenting, photographing the building as it is. And that's like the front, the sides, the back, getting inside every room. Now with digital cameras, you should go camera happy, photo happy. The more photos you get, the better it is, especially if you have more detail on the inside or even the outside. You want to document, say, the wallpaper. You want to document the trim, because maybe you need to replace that trim, so at least you'll have documentation. Because when you want to reconstruct something, if you have historic photographs or current photographs of what it was before, then it becomes very useful.
Yeah.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You're not putting in false stuff and creating a false sense of history. And then you have all this information that's like, okay, now I got to evaluate for significance. And so you take that historical data and the physical evidence, and then you evaluate it for its historical, architectural, engineering, cultural significance. Okay. And how was the construction constructed? How was it used? Who were the occupants with its history and development? And then you figure out, okay, like say the inside of the building, the first 2 rooms, the living room and the kitchen, they're pretty intact. We don't want to really do anything. They're pretty significant. They haven't changed a lot over time. Those are the spaces that we really want to restore. And I'll get to those terms a little bit later. And then there's the back bedroom or the back bathroom that has gotten remodeled over time. That's not really important in telling the story about the building. It's been remodeled. There's nothing historic about it. That space can take on, say, more modern changes to bring it up to code to a bathroom. So you look at all the spaces. You look at the exterior too. There's a lot of architectural detailing, and it goes back to the date of primary significance. Then you want to keep it. So a period of primary significance is basically looking at the history of the building and determining, okay, where was its most significant history? When did it occur? Sometimes that's just a single year, the year that the building was built. Sometimes it's a series of when it was built and when it got a significant addition. Say it was built in 1880, it got an addition in 1920, and then it got an addition in 1950, and then it got a garage in the 1980s. And the history, say, of somebody who lived there is very important from 1880 to 1950. It's like, all of that history is important, but the 1980 stuff is not important. It's not associated with that family. So it's like, you know what, I really don't care about it. So it's determining what's important for that particular resource. For the Skagit River Hydroelectric Project, our period of significance starts in either 17 or 1918, when initial construction started there, and ended in 1961 when we completed our final dam up there. And that basically reflected the way that the whole project was initially envisioned in the early 20s. We also want to have a chronology of construction and changes to the building to identify original elements, because you don't want to eliminate the historic fabric, is what I call it. And then also, it's a good opportunity to have a discussion with owner and users regarding the current and future use, to give you ideas of compatible uses for the building. So once you have this information, now you're like, okay, what do? I got to choose an appropriate treatment. And again, we go to the National Park Service and Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. We refer to them as the standards. And it provides guidance to historic building owners, managers, preservation consultants, architects, and so forth, prior to beginning the work on the building. Typically, it's always good to consult early in the project these guidelines, and also your local preservation jurisdiction or the State Historic Preservation Office, because they're there, they have preservation technical information and can offer advice. And covers interior and exterior work, and has 4 treatment standards, which I'll go through. The first one is preservation, and it's defined as the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of an historic property. And the work generally focuses on ongoing maintenance and the repair of the historic materials that are there, rather than extensive replacement and new construction. You don't want to update it. You want to preserve it. Say it's a 1790s house. It's not going to have a bathroom. It's not going to have electricity. It's not going to have HVAC. And you really want to tell that story of what life is like living there. You don't want to add all this other stuff. You want to preserve as much of it as it is there. You can do some sensitive upgrading, but the whole goal is to try and preserve what's there. So as it says at the bottom, requires retention of the greatest amount of historic fabric along with the building's historic form. So you really want to avoid any additions to it. The next one is rehabilitation. And so this is the process of making possible compatible use for a historic property through repair, alterations, and additions, while also preserving those portions or features which convey its historic, cultural, or architectural values. And so this standard, it's the most common standard used, offers the most flexibility, and because it acknowledges the need that, sometimes buildings need to be altered in order to be continued to be used, and the best use for a historic building is to use it as it was originally constructed for. So if you have a home, best continued use to use it is as a home, but sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes it's got to be like an office. And so there are things you have to do in order to upgrade that, so upgrade the plumbing, the electrical, life safety, egress. And so there are things you could do to that can be done sensitively, that you don't impact the building's historic character. So one example that comes to mind is ADA, getting ADA access to the building. Sometimes front doors aren't wide enough. Sometimes the main entrance for ADA is through a side entrance. You really don't want to do that, but sometimes it's like, you've got to find an alternative. And so that's why you see ramps or you see lifts to the side of the building where maybe a historic window was taken out and converted to a door. Or, for example, if, well, that's not going to be a good example, but there's much more flexibility with the building when you use this rehabilitation standard. The next one is restoration. And so basically it's the act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and character of a property as it appeared at a particular period of time. And so that could mean the removal of certain features that were added later. That example, 1880s house, 1920s addition, 1950s. You really don't want to talk about the 50s. It's not really relevant if you find in the history. You just want to keep the 1880s, 1920s portions. You want to eliminate all the 1950s, you can do it. That historic structures report will help guide those decisions and what that will mean if you decide to eliminate that. So again, it means limited and sensitive upgrading of those mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems and other code required work. So if you want to go to a particular period of time, say if you want to go back just to show the 1880s, the materials significant for that era, typical of that era, then you eliminate everything else. And that's pretty an extreme example. A lot of the time, I think it's for a richer experience to tell the story over time, how a property has changed. But every property is different, and that's the beauty of the standards. It gives you the flexibility to do that. And then the last one is reconstruction. And so basically, you're going to reconstruct what was there. So it means new construction, the form and features and detailing of a non-surviving site, landscape, building, structure, or object, for the purpose of replicating its appearance at a specific period of time. And so basically, it's recreating a vanished or non-surviving building with new materials for interpretive purposes. One example that comes to mind is in Philadelphia, it's Benjamin Franklin's home. There's no photograph, there's no painting of the building that he lived in, but there are they found the foundations to the building. And so what they did is they recreated out of a steel framework the outline of what his house may have looked like. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting reconstruction of his home based on homes of the era that were seen in other paintings. So it was somewhat based on historical research of the era, but it's also very clear in that it's made out of modern materials and it's just an interpretation of what may have been there. So another fun fact, or a fun fact about the Secretary of Interior Standards treatment, a project can have all 4 treatments. You can use all 4. There are certain spaces that you want to preserve. I'm thinking of Georgetown Steam Plant. You have the inside of the engine room. You have the 2 vertical Curtis steam turbines. You want to preserve that. You don't want to change that. Whereas you have windows, wood windows and doors that you want to restore, you want to reuse. And then you've got offices that you want to, update the electrical so that it's a usable space and have phone lines and, heaven forbid, the bathrooms, upgrade those. And so that becomes more of a rehabilitation. So this historic structures report will help guide the treatments. And then there are other spaces that, oh gosh, we can use that to put all our mechanical runs. All of our water lines, plumbing, sewage lines, whatever, and then hide them. Because it's a space that's already been, as I refer to, remodeled. So selecting a treatment depends on a number of factors. Depends on the level of historic significance, the physical condition, how intact is your resource, proposed use, is it compatible with historic fabric without destroying integrity and features, and then code and other regulations. You have to address them. Preservation doesn't get out of jail or get out of compliant card. It's a process we go through, and then we find solutions and compromises that everybody can agree to. I was just thinking of historical, museum that has 2 floors. You can't really put an elevator in there because it's a very old home. But you can do videotaping on the upper floors and bring that downstairs. So there's a little workstation or a station that somebody in a wheelchair can see who can't go upstairs. So there's things you could do. There's also, variances. So it just depends. And that's having that conversation with the local jurisdiction, the code department to help you. And then have the architect involved too. So I thought I'd talk about the Georgetown Steam Plant. That's pretty significant property for Seattle City Light. It was built in 1906 at what used to be the oxbow of the Duwamish River. And so in the upper left-hand corner, this is Frank Gilbreth, who actually was the contractor, built it out of concrete, fast-track construction. He was brought out from Boston by Stone & Webster through the Seattle Electric Company to build this plant that was originally designed to be brick and steel. And it was designed in early 1906. And as we all know, the Great San Francisco Earthquake and Fire happened in April of 1906. And shortly thereafter, they changed the design from brick and steel to concrete because they saw concrete as a fireproof material and also as a building material that was capable of withstanding the vibrations of the steam turbines that were being proposed to put in there. It's known for its two Curtis vertical steam turbine generators that are still there. They were installed in 1907 and I think 1908.
Aren't they examples of like the only two remaining examples of some of those kinds of turbines that are still working?
As far as I know, there are 8 in the country,
Oh, 8.
and we've got 2 of them, so yay. And they're still in the original location in situ. I've been curious about the others of the 8 and see if they're still there, so I think I need to go on a road trip. It also has, so anyways, it's Frank with his wife Lillian, who's quite a phenomenal woman too in her own right. She got her doctorate in industrial psychology. It was the first one issued, I think, in 1918 by Brown University. But she was also a University of California, Berkeley graduate. So, and for her bachelor's and then for her master's. So, I always have to.
Yeah, she's on there.
So, but you know, they had 12 kids. I know there's only 11 there. One of them didn't make it to adulthood, but yeah, raising her family, supporting her husband, pretty phenomenal. But he managed to build this concrete building in record time. And so you see in the upper right-hand corner, probably a few years after it was completed, where it had the 2 smokestacks. It had 3, one was through the roof, and then as they were building the shorter of the 2 smokestacks, had 2, and then they added the 3rd one and then deleted the metal one that was through the roof. And so that's the view from the Dawn Shore. When it curved there, of course, it got realigned starting in 1916 through 1919 by the Army Corps, and now it's about, I don't know, a mile away. So the center photograph was taken in early 1909, a couple of workers.
Why would they have,
Yeah, talk about recreating, getting the overalls, but anyways.
why
and
would
then-
they have 2
What?
smokestacks instead of just one big one or something? Do you know why they had 2?
They had 2 because they had the 16 boilers in there, so they had 8 on one side and the other, and so one smokestack was for one row of boilers and the other one
Interesting.
for
Okay.
the other. Yeah. You can see in the lower right-hand corner the 1917 addition that was added, where they added a vertical or a horizontal turbine generator there. And the thought was that they would continue to expand. But by this time, hydroelectric generation was becoming preferred. It was cleaner because this plant was built to burn oil and coal, and started burning oil first and then switched to coal when the U.S. entered World War I, and then continued burning coal until I think a little bit after World War II, and then it got converted to oil. And then what you see, the angled piece going into the top part of the building on the south elevation, that was the coal conveyor that would bring coal up, because the building has built-in coal bunkers on the top. And so you can see also then the little, I call it little mushroom smokestacks. That then became the exhaust system after they tore down the smokestacks, I want to say in the late 30s, because of the airport expansion. And then, of course, the lower left-hand corner is one of those Curtis vertical steam turbines. So,
On the north aspect of that lower right photograph, that corrugated steel, is that still does it still exist, or was that
Yes.
torn down? Oh, what?
yes, it still exists. It's all corrugated. The entire building got painted in 1969 with this lovely vinyl paint, which is not exactly great for concrete. And then it got painted again in like 1985. So that's where we're looking. That's what came up in our historic structure report, one of the many things. So that historic structures report led us to decide to play with it, since the plant is near the airport. There's 180 windows and doors in that building. Wood, all of them, I'd say majority of them, wood. and we didn't want to replace them. We wanted to restore them. They're original to the building, and so we needed help. And so there's the Park Service coming in to help us. And so we went to Evie's Landing, and we asked the preservation carpenters there for help. And so they have been working on restoring the buildings, and it's a very unique relationship. And we're just so happy with the building because it's, I mean, these windows are just spectacular. They're finished product. They're doing such an awesome job. And so basically it involves taking down the window and putting plywood on there, taking them to the shop, stripping all the paint off, stripping all the caulking off, cleaning the glass, doing repairs to the window pane, putting it all back together, priming it, painting it, bringing it back, and then installing it. So they've been doing that, for the last 4 or 5 years. It's pretty spectacular.
Evie's Landing is familiar. Where is that location? Where is that?
Whidbey Island.
Oh, it's a place where they do windows, I guess.
Well, they have their workshop there. The other thing that came up in the historic structures report for Seattle City Light is that this building had an incredible thick layer of paint that was not doing it any favors. There's a lot of cracks, there's a lot of spalling. When moisture gets trapped between that thick paint layer, because the building is reinforced concrete, it's got rebar, but it's so close to the surface, it's not as buried as it should have, as it typically is today. And so water has infiltrated in there over time, and it's rusted and busted the concrete. And so the recommendation was that we take the paint off. And we're like, oh. So we knew this project was going to have to be done in phases. And so this is one of the test panels that we had our historic concrete specialists come out and do to figure out which product would be best to take the paint off. And so what you're seeing here, and the one furthest on the left, is the original concrete color. And so that then became our goal to get the building, once we stripped the whole thing, to get it to that surface. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, this water can infiltrate, so you can see a piece of the rebar. We had the whole building sounded, so basically the guy was up there tapping, and when you hit damaged concrete, it makes a different sound. And it's absolutely amazing to see the two guys on the lift working, tap, and it's really spectacular. And so they would mark it off, and then they put it on a plan, and eventually it became into our architectural set to guide the repairs when we finally put the construction. And so this problem is all over the building, and it's mostly because the rebar is too close to the surface.
Do you have time for questions or not right now?
I've got like 10 more slides.
Okay.
So
I'll look
can
at
you
those.
hold off?
Yep.
So end game. This is our before. This is what we wanted. I mean, they're absolutely spectacular.
Yeah.
We had to go through a review process through Seattle Landmarks to get the colors approved, to get the work, and the whole architectural drawing set reviewed. And it takes time. So, the HSR helps you plan ahead. Here's an example of the huge, distinctive double doors. And this is the finished product.
Cool.
And that's like, wow.
Wow, that's
Making the
beautiful.
rest of the building look, needing a little TLC. It's getting there. So applying for grants, really quickly. There are different types of grants. There's the county level, there's the state level, and then there's the federal level. So we have Horticulture, we have the Washington State Historical Society Heritage Capital Projects, and then we have the Save America's Treasures grant program on the right that they award up to $500,000. And it helps when
Wow.
those are geared for those National Historic Landmark properties. And I thought, I'm going to go after that. They're hard, though. They're
Did you
hard to
get that? Did you
No,
get that for this?
Not yet. So some tips. Obtain property owner cooperation if you're working in partnership. City Light happens to own the building, so yeah, let's go for it. Networking and partnering up is always helpful. Pool your efforts. Find out, hey, who's good at this? Who's done your work? Who's done design? Who's done repair work? It's great to network. I found that it's just really useful. And then you get support from one another. And part of these grants, they want to see that you are engaging the community. You have support from the community in the village, so to speak, to support your project after the restoration or rehabilitation work is done. Know that grants have strings attached. They're usually what I call them preservation covenants or easements. You have to hold on to the property, at least for the grants that we've gotten for 13 years. Save America's Treasures grants, I think it's a 50-year covenant. So you have to commit to maintain that property for that long period and open it to the public, whatever it is you agree to with the granting agency. Find your local preservation regulatory agency, so Seattle Landmarks and Department of Neighborhoods, King County Preservation Office, and then talk to the State Historic Preservation Office too, because if you're going after a state grant. Find out if you qualify for your grants. Sometimes there's grants for construction, and sometimes there's grants for planning, for doing your planning documents to help you get to construction. When you do your application, leave in preservation terminology and vocabulary in a manner that conveys your understanding of those principles. Because the reviewer will pick up on if you don't know. That comes across. Don't reinvent the wheel. If you have a history and nomination or reports, use it. Quote it and use it. This is something that I always go back to the grant application and documents and manual, and I read it and read it and read it all over. Ask questions, start early. I had a lot of questions for the Heritage Capital Programs grant person. It's like, okay, so what does this mean if I do this? In your application, are you conveying how urgent this project is? I was trying to convey that this concrete is really important because provides the envelope for the building. I want to get a weather-tight envelope to protect the valuable machinery inside the building. And it's really urgent because this concrete now is falling off, and more chunks keep falling off every year, especially during the winter. Have you tailored your project information to the grant? Don't use one grant application and just cut and paste the whole thing into another. You got to tailor it because people will notice that. Be concise, be clear. Remember, grant reviewers are reviewing a lot of applications. Make yours stand out for the right reasons, the wrong reasons. Spell checker and word count are your best friend. And be a ruthless editor. I kid you not. Get your colleague to read it. Say, hey, you have to do this. I'll buy you coffee, just read it. Do they understand what you're writing? Where can you cut down? Where can you add? Have you answered the grants questions? I keep going back to that. I always go back to that. Okay, am I answering the question? Can I be clear? Can I add more? Sometimes it's a very short answer because it's a somewhat simple project. Sometimes it's very complex, so just make sure you answer the grants questions. Do you have the required copies or file format? Because now a lot of them, they want you to fill out the application online. For the federal level, start early. That's all I gotta say, because it's an incredible amount of just learning the lingo. Whew. Do your references to photos and figures line up? And then do you have sufficient photos? Which leads me to my next thing, photography for your grant applications or for documenting your building. Your weather can be a friend or a foe. Time of day, gotta know where your sun is. Context, gotta look at the bigger picture. Elevations, putting our best elevations forward, face forward. And then details, a closer inspection showing what your problems are. So I just have some examples of weather kind of working with you and against you. And so you've got the blue skies, just really makes the building pop, and then you've got this gray thing at the lower right-hand corner. I'm like, yeah, the cloud coverage wasn't helping me. It was just washing out my building. So I had to come a different day to get that photograph right. Time of day is important. If you want to get, this is the south and the west elevation in the upper left-hand corner. I did that early afternoon. Perfect. But if I want to get the east elevation, all of a sudden it's in harsh shadow. And it wasn't so bad if, it wouldn't be so bad if the sun was behind a cloud, but that's what I had that day, so I'm like, ugh. So I can either manipulate it through Word or through Photoshop, or I come back in the morning and get the other elevations. So just depends. Context is important to let whoever's reviewing your grant know where is this building located. So I think a checkerboard gives a clue that it's near an airport and that it's pretty flat all the way around it. So it's a very visible building. I would have taken a photo from I-5, but I was driving. Context, this is the approach, the temporary approach to the steam plant. You can see it's pretty monumental and there's a pretty flat area around it. So it's very visible on most elevations. And this is from deep in the lot, looking back to the building. And the blast fence on the right-hand side is the side that faces the airport. So doing elevations, stand right in front of it, take a shot. And this is the upper left-hand corner. You're just basically standing in front of it, trying to get kind of an even border around it. Sometimes your building is so big you can't do that, so you kind of have to do it at a slight angle, where most of the emphasis is on the elevation that you want. In the center one, it's mostly the west elevation. And then you go and walk down and you get a similar angle photo of the far end that's not very visible in the other photograph. Some cases, doing a frontal is not as useful. The bottom two show kind of two elevations, and that kind of gives the bigger story. And you can see a lot of the character-defining features, the big picture window, the porch, the gable roof, and the siding. And so this is of the Skagit project. And then details. You want to apply for a grant to repair your windows? It's always good to include photos of the windows, inside and out, if you want. And then details showing what your problem is. So here the caulking is falling out. The middle one shows how the window functions, not this one. It's a different one. But then the other lower right-hand corner shows kind of how the framing works. So that way they understand what you're talking about. So that's my last slide, and I just want to say thank you to the Southwest Seattle Historical Society for sponsoring the event, Kathy for the invitation, and then for the Seattle Public Library's West Seattle Branch Library for hosting, sponsoring the event, and then also shout out to Fort Culture as well, because they also funded part of my project, the Paint Removal project. So, and with that,
Thank you.
any questions?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. There we go.